Hey, what's going on? It's Coach Luca.
I'm Joel Jamieson.
And today we're going to go over the top 5 methods to improve all-around conditioning. Now, listen, there's always individualization as far as like what are your goals that you want to achieve. What is it that like is the missing link, the weakness? Where are you? What's point A? What's point B? But this is a good filter on like, when we generally look at, if put it this way, if you're adding cardio and conditioning to become more fit, more resilient, to be able to harder to kill, to be able to do more stuff, like this is a good list. And we're kind of Joel's going to go down the list of, what you would start with and kind of build upon.
Exactly. So look, the first thing is, why do we use a method, right? A method is basically an organized way to train something, right? It's a certain amount of sets or reps or rest intervals or specific resistance. It's a way to do a particular exercise or exercises that has specific benefits and reasons for doing it, as opposed to the way a lot of people approach conditioning, which is just go hard, right? Just do some random interval, go hard, right? Like that's kind of the traditional
Or it's
approach.
like, I like this exercise,
Yeah.
Put them together, go until I'm really tired and can't breathe, and I'm going to keep doing that. And so we want to organize this a lot more and put it, like I said, there's principles and then there's methods, right? So we're taking principles of conditioning and like organizing them into methods that you can use, and we'll go over so that you basically get the most bang for your buck. Meaning, if you put in the effort, you get that return on investment. You're not putting a lot of effort in and getting just this much out of it because, like I said, you're not using the right method for the right goal.
Exactly. So there's philosophy, and then there's methods, and then there's exercise and principles, right? So number one is good old-fashioned, old faithful, what we call cardiac output, also called low intensity steady state, LSD, whatever you want to call it. It's the low and slow cardio. The reality is it's fallen out of favor for a number of reasons. The most biggest one is people are short-sighted and they want results now. And if you look at research, it shows you, really high intensity method versus a low intensity method. And you look at that over 4 weeks, you're like, well, the high intensity method outperforms it, right? So I should just do that. Well, the problem is this is your foundation builder. And if you look at this over the long run, 4-week, 8-week, 12-week, those differences would dissipate very, very rapidly. So cardiac output, how do we do it? Typically speaking, we're talking about like a heart rate of somewhere between 120, 140, 150, kind of somewhere in that range depending on your fitness level. The best way to know kind of where to be at is you should go to pace where I can still talk.
Yep.
Right? I could talk to Luca while I'm doing whatever it is that I'm doing and have some sort of normal conversation. If I'm doing this and I can't talk, I'm going too hard. So if you don't have a heart rate monitor, you can use the talk test as a easy way to make sure you're at the right pace.
And one of the things, so first of all, we use this in our rebound workouts, which Joel actually coined and organized, but we do from everything from mobility, to making sure that the joints are feeling good, breathing exercises, and then we go into this, where to not keep it boring, we actually do different exercises. So it might be sleds and then energy systems, Jacob's ladders, airdyne bikes, things of that nature, and keep it in this range. But this is some other things that like I always love, to recommend is, hey, do something productive, listen to a podcast, an audio book, something else while you're in this 120 to 150 range, and you could do it at home on a bike, go for a run. There's many different ways that you can do this. Obviously, if you do it in the gym, you can make it more fun by doing different things. Even if you're at home, you can jump from a rower to a bike to do bodyweight exercises. Like I said, just make sure you're keeping it in here. And a good start is 30 minutes, 25,
25, 30 probably low end, 30 minutes. You can obviously progress that up. But if you're just getting started, 20, 30 minutes 3 times a week is a starting point. And I'll say too, if you're a coach and you're only seeing someone twice a week, I'm probably not going to spend my entire session doing this.
No, of course not. Yeah.
It's not going to be the best experience. But I want to educate them on the importance of doing this stuff outside the gym. So if they're just starting out, make sure they go for a hike. Make sure they get outside and do a slow light jog, or make sure they get an exercise bike, whatever they have at home. A lot of people have stuff at home now. But this is the foundational piece from the standpoint of its low intensity. It builds our vascular network. It starts to build our heart in the way that creates the right foundation. Now, when we step up from that, we want to go to what's called tempo intervals. And tempo intervals are unique in the sense that they are an interval, and most people think of intervals as high intensity. That's everyone talks about high intensity interval training. But not every interval has to be high intensity. Now, this concept or this method really was kind of popularized, I would say, by Charlie Francis, the late Charlie Francis, when it came to sprint athletes. And he was training the fastest athletes in the world, and he was doing a ton of tempo intervals in between those max speed sprints. And it's really simple. You go somewhere between about 8 to 10 seconds at somewhere around 70-ish, 75% of your max speed or max effort. And that's really the key here. Again, this is not a high intensity interval, it's a moderate intensity interval. So you want to keep this in that 70 to 75% range, somewhere in there. And the best way to know where that is to go 100% for one, and then try to shoot for about 70 to 75% of that distance, or that heart rate of the effort. It should feel like you're getting some work in, but you should not feel gassed and tired and just dead after these.
Okay, so an example, as Joel mentioned, if we were going to do, let's take a sprint, for example, right? If you ran your maximum sprint in 8 to 10 seconds, what is the yards that you would achieve, right? What yards would you get to? Well, that's an easy way to then go like, well, let's do 70% of those yards in that time frame, and that's going to be your intervals. And usually the other thing too that's pretty important, that during your rest periods, you're moving here.
Yeah,
right?
I like active recovery here. So 60 seconds of what I would call active recovery. Now the biggest difference is active recovery is like it sounds. You're moving, you're doing something, versus passive recovery, which we're just kind of sitting there doing nothing. You know, typically, again, if you're just kind of starting out, just walking and moving around is an important way to be active. If you already have a reasonable level of fitness, you're starting to build your way up, you can do a really slow jog, not a 70, 75%, but just, you know, a slower jog. You could jump rope, you could jump on an Airdyne and just pedal slowly. Just doing that sort of active recovery will add to the benefit of doing this type of interval.
Yeah, and one of the things too that we love to do in this active recovery is having people do stuff that they don't do enough of, which is maybe thoracic mobility drills, opening up the hips, doing some glute activation exercises, stuff like that, and then going back at it. There's a lot of different ways that you can do it, but just to give you guys some examples of, you know, what works well. And if you have a bike at home, same thing, right? Push for 10 seconds as fast as you can. How far do you get? Then as you're doing your 70, 75% repeats, do 70, 75% of that distance, and you're going to get the intensity to work at.
Exactly. And if you're really deconditioned, or you're trained so much deconditioned, you could start out with as little as 6 or 8 of these, right? And you can build up to 10, 15, you know, even up to 20. So again, because it is a moderate interval, it's a good way to start to build that work capacity and volume over time. This is something I'll use a lot of times in early off-season training for field athletes or team athletes that spend a lot of time running. We'll just build some repetition of this volume of this lower intensity running to get the lower body in a better state to be able to handle those higher intensity efforts that we're going to get to as we progress.
So what would be after this?
Number 3, I'd go up to what I call high resistance intervals. Now, what you'll see is as we progress up the ladder, what we're really doing here is we're upping the intensity from an energy system standpoint, and we're therefore recruiting more of this fast twitch muscle fibers, because as we develop our conditioning, we want all of our muscle fibers to be better at utilizing oxygen if our goal is to increase our endurance, which is a big piece of the conditioning puzzle. So high resistance intervals are a way to recruit those fast twitch muscle fibers, or at least the faster twitch than these two, in a way that's going to have much less likelihood of injury if we're just starting out, in a way we can do more volume, because what we're doing is using resistance to slow down the speed. So normally when people do intervals, they just go 100% speed, right? They do something as hard and as fast as they possibly can. Now the problem with that is, again, if you aren't very well conditioned, you are going to increase your risk of injury a bit, and you can't do a whole lot of volume with them because you're going to gas yourself out and you're going to take a long time to recover. So really easy here, we find a way to add resistance, and there are multiple ways to do that. You can get a bike that's got a resistance on it. You can use something like a VersaClimber. You can sprint up an incline or some kind of hill. There's lots of ways to think about adding resistance. It could be a sled push or a prowler, but doing something where you have a high level of resistance to slow down your max speed. And then we want to keep our reps fairly short here, 5 seconds, 8 seconds, maybe 10 seconds at the most. These are short, high intensity against high resistance.
So these are 5 to 10 seconds.
And I tend to go towards the short end of this, 4 or 5 seconds, all out. But again, because we are going against high resistance, you want to slow yourself down to probably 70, 80% of what your top speed would be if you didn't have resistance. So we want to pick a fairly high level of resistance here so that we're slowing ourselves down just because we have that resistance. But that resistance is going to increase that fast twitch fiber utilization, but it's also going to allow us to do more reps because it's not as fast, it's not as CNS intensive.
So I love the sled work for this one. But here's the thing too, because if somebody went and started doing all-out sprints, the tissues just may not be ready for it. And then honestly, it's like one of those things, you start too much volume, too high of an intensity, things go wrong. And this is kind of a good way to start building that up. Okay, so, and again, very underutilized. Very rarely do I ever see people doing that where, you know, you actually probably, if you watch my stories, see where I'm doing 5, 6, 7 seconds of a heavy sled and going after it as fast as I can, and then doing like a 55-second break, a long break, and then repeating it, and just walking, active, like again,
active
some
recovery.
active recovery rather than just sitting down. And again, underutilized, important, and that's method number 3.
And it went real quick too. You can do quite a few of these, right? So again, you might start out in the low end, 5 or 6 reps, but you can go up to 10, 12, 15, 16 reps. You can do a lot of reps because it's very short, and again, it's a slower speed. So you can build up to these over time, as with all these methods. You don't have to start, 34, 5, 60 minutes of this.
Yep.
This could be a few minutes of a few reps and build up.
Okay.
So next up, we have explosive repeat.
One of my favorites.
Okay, so explosive repeat is a great way to build muscular endurance. So there's 2 big pieces of the conditioning puzzle. One is the cardiovascular system itself. It has to supply and deliver oxygen into every cell in your body. And then 2 is the muscular endurance, which is largely the ability of those muscles to pull the oxygen out and use it effectively. So we have to train both components. The explosive repeat is a muscular endurance specific method. So your goal here, again, you will develop certainly some of the cardiovascular, but we're trying to develop specific muscle groups. Now, the reason it's called explosive repeat is because, just like it sounds, we're going to do something explosive, and we're going to do it over and over again. So we're developing a repetitive explosive power.
So usually how long would these, for instance, repeats be?
Yeah, you can start in the low end at 10 seconds, and you can go up to 20, 30 seconds, typically speaking. Sometimes you can go a bit longer, but usually somewhere in that time frame. You can do the reps, or you can do seconds, whatever the case may be. But the other key here is you want to have something that's cyclical. So like a squat jump, where you're getting this repetition of cyclical explosive movements, or med ball throws, or things that, again, have this elastic cyclical component, because one of the things we're training is that efficiency in our ability to generate power in these elastic type exercises. It could be jumping, bounding, lots of stuff like that.
Yep. We use this in training sessions when we actually do explosive repeats as a whole team training session. For instance, kettlebell deadlift jumps are excellent for this. Actually, I think we've done a bunch of videos on the methods of doing that.
Yep.
And trust me, most people will say like, 10 seconds of kettlebell deadlift jumps, but when you actually really get after it and every jump is maximal, like it hits an energy system that most people aren't used to.
Yep.
So just another thing on this one, what are the rest periods? Because rest periods are going to be longer in explosive repeats.
I mean, look, you can start out like as high as 90 seconds, and you can go all the way down to 30 seconds over time. So the rest intervals are really a big area for you to play with. Start with longer rest intervals, and then decrease them over time. The quality of work is what really matters. So this isn't a case, as in most conditioning methods, the same rule applies. My goal is to not make myself as tired as possible. Like, that's not the measuring stick. I might be tired as I progress, but I'm going to do everything with the best technique I possibly can. And as soon as I start to see my technique just falling apart, I either need to rest longer so I can recover and I can do them properly, or I need to stop doing more sets. So our goal should never be to go so hard that we can't do exercises correctly. So
Correct.
Use that as a guide for your rest interval.
And like I said, Joe mentioned this in, like I said, in one of the videos of 3 principles when it comes to building energy systems. This is key for anything that we talk about, is that you make sure that your form and your movement is high quality, even under fatigue. So if you cannot maintain quality movement under fatigue, don't continue just going, because what you're going to do is actually reinforce really bad patterns under fatigue. So when a game comes, or when you're doing something that matters, you're going to fall apart, and you're going to get injuries. So that's why this is really important. That you can start with lower, I would say, sets here, but just make sure it's great form, and then you build it up over time, and you will be not only conditioned, but you'll be conditioned under duress and still be able to have quality movement.
Exactly. You can start as few as 4 to 6 sets. You can work all the way up to 10, 12, sometimes more over time. But I would tend to start adding more time per set or per rep, and then decreasing rest intervals before I went above too many sets before I did that.
And last but not least here is, I'll put it over here, is the threshold method. Now, and you mentioned too that threshold method, not necessarily something that everybody needs to do, but I actually do this decently often, and it's very, very, very challenging. But talk a little bit more about this and the benefits.
Yeah, I mean, it's something you want to work towards. I wouldn't start out here. Like I said, I wouldn't take a beginner and max effort lift them. But the threshold method is really pushing our limits of aerobic capacity, aerobic power, before we start getting really deep into the anaerobic zone. And really the threshold is just that. It's kind of that buffer area where we're starting to become more and more anaerobic, we're starting to use more and more energy, and if we keep going higher and higher, we're going to fatigue faster. This is kind of that point where we're just below that, all right? So the key thing here is to find that pace depending on what exercise that you're doing. The best way to do that is with a heart rate monitor. Now, to get a true anaerobic threshold, you'd have to go get a laboratory test and you get numbers. But in the real world, we just try to find a pace where we can barely sustain it for maybe like the 8 to 12, 14-minute range. If we can barely sustain it, we feel like we can go, but it's a lot of effort and it's a struggle. That's probably about the right pace. For most people, that's gonna be somewhere between 75 and 85% of their max. If you're highly conditioned, it can certainly be higher than that. If you're very deconditioned, it can be lower than that. But you want to find this kind of, struggle pace, I guess you could call it. Another way to kind of get an estimate here is to do 12 minutes at a specific exercise all out, and then take your average across that distance, and that's probably a good starting point.
So yeah, that would be an example. We do this, obviously running is one way to do that. At the gym, we'll go on the Airdyne bike or any of the energy systems, but Airdyne is a super simple one for anybody. 12 minutes, go as far as you can. Try to keep a steady tempo that's very, very challenging. And then from there, we'll get an average heart rate zone, and plus minus 5 beats per minute is kind of where that threshold is going to be. And then for the threshold method, what's a good starting point as far as like interval time? Or should I say?
Yeah, you could start as low as 3 minutes and go up to 8, 10, 12. I wouldn't do a whole. You can go longer than that, but for someone whose goal is just all around conditioning, you really don't need to be doing half an hour of this straight. You can certainly do 2 or 3 sets of 5, 8, 10 minutes. And then the rest is going to be anywhere from 2 to 4 or 5 minutes, depending on how long you went. If you went 8, 10 minutes, then you're definitely going to rest, longer, 4, 5, 6 minutes. If you only went 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, then your rest interval can be a bit shorter.
And so this is what's so great about this is that, we wanted to break it down in kind of like sequencing, because too many people, when they do conditioning, will just jump into it and go extremely hard and actually not use these methods to, I would say, strategically and progressively build their cardio in a smart way, and kind of just throw everything at the wall, but really just think, hey, I should just train as hard as possible and be out of breath. That does not fall into these methods and the principles that we're talking about. And like, again, what this helps you do is get the most bang for your buck. Train smart. You're still training hard, but hard is smart, meaning do it in a progressive way to where you get results, period, right? So use these 5 methods to improve your overall conditioning, because it's going to benefit you. Like I said, if you're just a human and you want to improve health, body composition, fitness levels, or if you're an athlete and want to create a really solid base to then build upon, these are the 5 methods to really help. If you guys want to learn some of this, like I said, I'm a big fan. Our whole team uses this. Our gym uses all these methodologies from the conditioning certification that Joe has. So make sure you check it out below, because that's not where you only learn all the principles and much, much deeper dive into this, but teaches you how to write these programs for yourself and your clients. And again, this is a game changer. It's been a game changer for us in the last decade plus learning this. So we'll see you next time with more, I would say, dropping knowledge from program design and cardio. Peace out.
Peace out.